March 15, 1943. Somewhere in the dense jungles of New Guinea, Staff Sergeant Thomas Reeves of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment sat on a fallen log, carefully wrapping medical tape around his left foot where the standard-issue leather combat boot had rubbed his ankle raw for the third time that week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Around him, other paratroopers from his squad performed similar field repairs, stuffing extra socks into boots that never quite fit right, applying moleskin to blisters that refused to heal, cursing the equipment that was supposed to keep them combat ready, but instead left them hobbling through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. 20 yards away, behind a makeshift barbed wire enclosure guarded by two privates with Thompson submachine guns, a group of Japanese prisoners of war watched with barely concealed amusement. The captured soldiers, remnants of a company that had been overrun during the Allied push toward Leh, had been marching for 2 days in their own footwear without complaint, without visible injury, without the constant maintenance that plagued their captors. One prisoner, a sergeant named Takeshi Yamamoto, according to the identification tags examined during processing, gestured toward Reeves's boots and said something in Japanese that prompted quiet laughter from his fellow captives. The American guards, understanding nothing but the tone, shifted uncomfortably and told the prisoners to shut up, but the damage to morale had been done. Here were the supposedly superior American forces, backed by the greatest industrial capacity the world had ever seen, unable to manufacture a simple boot that could survive jungle conditions without crippling the men who wore them. What neither the American paratroopers nor their Japanese captives understood in that moment was that the boots being ridiculed represented only the visible failure of a much larger equipment crisis, and that the solution already being deployed would revolutionize airborne operations in ways that would shift the balance of the Pacific War. The pattern of contempt and misunderstanding about footwear technology had roots that stretched back years before the first American paratrooper ever jumped into combat, embedded in cultural assumptions about warfare, industrial capacity, and the very nature of military innovation. The crisis began in December 1941, immediately after Pearl Harbor, when the United States Army scrambled to equip rapidly expanding airborne divisions with appropriate gear for a type of warfare that barely existed in American military doctrine. Airborne operations, the concept of delivering combat troops by parachute directly into enemy territory, represented cutting-edge military theory that had been pioneered by the Soviet Union in the 1930s and refined by German forces during their spectacular victories in 1940 and 1941. American military planners, observing German airborne assaults on Belgium, the Netherlands, and Crete, recognized that vertical envelopment offered tactical advantages that could overcome fortified positions and achieve surprise that ground forces could never match. The problem was equipment. Everything about airborne operations required specialized gear designed to survive the violent shock of parachute deployment, the impact of landing, and immediate combat upon hitting the ground. Standard infantry equipment, designed for soldiers who walked to battle or rode in trucks, proved catastrophically inadequate for paratroopers who jumped from aircraft at 120 miles per hour and landed hard on whatever terrain happened to be beneath them. The boot crisis emerged as the most visible and demoralizing failure of this equipment challenge. The standard United States Army combat boot in 1941, designated the M1938 service shoe, was a well-made piece of leather footwear that had evolved gradually from designs dating back to World War I. It featured a full-grain leather upper, leather sole, rubber heel, and lace closure that extended to just above the ankle. For conventional infantry operations in Europe or North America, marching on roads or fighting in open terrain, the M1938 was adequate, if not exceptional. It provided reasonable protection, moderate durability, and sufficient support for soldiers carrying standard combat loads over typical terrain. For airborne operations in the Pacific Theater, the M1938 was a disaster waiting to happen, and that disaster materialized almost immediately when American paratroopers began combat operations in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The problems were numerous and compounding. The leather construction, while traditional and familiar to military procurement officers, absorbed water like a sponge in tropical conditions where humidity rarely dropped below 80%, and rain was a daily occurrence. Within hours of landing in jungle environments, boots would be soaked through, adding pounds of water weight and creating conditions perfect for tropical ulcers and fungal infections that could disable a soldier as effectively as enemy fire. The leather soles, designed for temperate climates and relatively dry conditions, became slippery death traps on the muddy jungle trails and moss-covered logs that characterized Pacific combat zones. Paratroopers attempting to move quickly found themselves sliding and falling, unable to maintain footing on terrain where a fall could mean a broken ankle or worse. The ankle-height design, barely covering the joint, provided virtually no support during parachute landings where soldiers hit the ground carrying 60 to 80 pounds of equipment and weapons. Twisted ankles and stress fractures became epidemic among airborne units, with some drops resulting in casualty rates from landing injuries that exceeded combat losses. Medical officers filed report after report documenting soldiers who made perfect parachute landings only to collapse when their ankles gave out under the combined stress of impact and equipment weight. The lacing system, using cotton laces that rotted in humid conditions, failed regularly, leaving soldiers with boots that couldn't be secured properly, and that loosened during movement, causing blisters and hotspots that became infected in the tropical environment. Most damningly, the boots simply fell apart under the stress of airborne operations and jungle warfare. Soldiers reported soles separating from uppers after just weeks of use, leather cracking and splitting along stress points, seams pulling apart under the constant wet-dry cycles of tropical service. A boot that might last 6 months in temperate conditions with proper care would be reduced to useless scraps of leather within 6 weeks in the Pacific. Replacement boots were in chronically short supply because procurement officers in Washington, operating from comfortable offices thousands of miles from combat zones, consistently underestimated how quickly footwear would fail in conditions they had never personally experienced. Staff Sergeant Thomas Reeves had joined the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment in early 1942, volunteering for airborne service with the naive enthusiasm of a 22-year-old from rural Pennsylvania, who thought jumping out of airplanes sounded more exciting than slogging through mud with a regular infantry unit. His training at Fort Benning, Georgia had been grueling but exhilarating, learning to pack parachutes, to exit aircraft at speed, to hit the ground and immediately transition to combat readiness. The instructors had emphasized speed, aggression and initiative, drilling into every parachute that they would be landing behind enemy lines, outnumbered and isolated, dependent entirely on their own skills and the men beside them. The romance of airborne service, the silver wings pinned to the uniform, the extra jump pay, the elite status within the Army, all of it had seemed worth the additional danger and discomfort. That romanticism had died somewhere over the Pacific Ocean during the transport to Australia, killed by the mundane reality of equipment failures and administrative incompetence. Reeves and his fellow paratroopers had arrived in theater to discover that their specialized equipment had been shipped separately and had gone missing somewhere in the supply chain. They spent 3 weeks wearing whatever gear could be scrounged from regular infantry stocks, including the M1938 boots that were manifestly unsuited for either airborne operations or jungle combat. When their own equipment finally arrived, the boots proved to be standard infantry issue rather than the specialized jump boots they had trained with at Benning. Complaints to the supply officers were met with bureaucratic indifference and lectures about making do with available resources rather than demanding special treatment. The first combat jump, a night drop onto an airfield near Leh in September 1943, had been a revelation in how badly equipment failures could compromise mission success. Reeves landed hard on the edge of the runway, his ankles screaming in protest, as the M1938 boots provided virtually no support under his combat load.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He rolled as trained and came up running toward the rally point, immediately aware that his left boot was filling with blood from where the leather had cut into his ankle during landing. Around him in the darkness he could hear other paratroopers cursing and groaning as they struggled with similar injuries. 3 men from his stick broke ankles on landing, one so severely that the bone protruded through the skin, rendering them combat ineffective before they fired a single shot. The mission succeeded in capturing the airfield, but the cost in landing injuries was appalling. Out of 400 men who jumped that night, 67 were casualties from the landing itself, including twisted ankles, broken bones and severe lacerations where boots had failed to protect feet and lower legs. The Japanese defenders, caught by surprise and outnumbered, had been swept aside relatively easily, but the airborne unit was significantly weakened before combat even began. Medical officers treating the wounded filed reports documenting that landing injuries exceeded combat casualties by nearly 2 to 1, a ratio that should have been impossible for an operation that achieved tactical surprise. What made the boot crisis particularly galling for American paratroopers was the visible contrast with Japanese footwear. The prisoners taken during subsequent operations wore jikatabi, traditional split-toe canvas boots with rubber soles that dated back centuries in Japanese culture but had been adapted for military use. These boots, which looked primitive and unsophisticated to Western eyes, performed remarkably well in jungle conditions. The canvas upper dried quickly after getting wet, preventing the rot and breakdown that plagued leather boots. The rubber sole, formed in a pattern that mimicked bare feet with separate compartments for the big toe, provided excellent traction on wet surfaces and muddy trails. The design extended well above the ankle, providing support that reduced sprains and stress injuries. American soldiers, including Reeves, initially dismissed these boots as evidence of Japanese industrial backwardness. Here was an Asian military power using canvas footwear while American forces wore proper leather boots, surely a sign of technological inferiority and resource scarcity. The fact that Japanese prisoners marched without complaint in these boots, that they showed fewer foot injuries despite having survived weeks or months in the jungle, that they seemed genuinely amused by American boot problems. All of this was rationalized as evidence that Japanese soldiers were simply tougher, more accustomed to hardship, perhaps less sensitive to pain due to cultural factors that American troops didn't fully understand. This dismissive attitude toward Japanese equipment extended far beyond footwear and reflected broader prejudices that permeated American military thinking about Asian capabilities. Intelligence reports from before Pearl Harbor had confidently assessed that Japanese military equipment was uniformly inferior to American gear, that Japanese industrial capacity was decades behind Western nations, that Japanese soldiers succeeded only through fanatical willingness to die, rather than through technological or tactical superiority. These assumptions had been shattered spectacularly in the opening months of the war when Japanese forces conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies in a campaign that demonstrated tactical sophistication, operational excellence, and equipment that was in many cases superior to what Allied forces possessed. Yet the prejudices persisted, particularly regarding seemingly simple equipment like boots. American military culture in the 1940s held deep conviction that Western industrial methods and materials were inherently superior to anything Asian nations could produce. Leather was a proper material for military boots because that was what armies had used for centuries. Canvas was a cheap substitute used by militaries too poor or backward to afford proper leather. The idea that canvas might actually be superior for certain applications, that traditional Japanese design might have practical advantages over Western conventions, was simply not taken seriously by procurement officers in Washington who had never set foot in a tropical jungle. The breakthrough that would solve the American boot crisis and revolutionize airborne equipment came not from military procurement offices or equipment laboratories but from an unlikely source. Captain Robert Henderson, a supply officer with the 11th Airborne Division stationed in Australia, had a background that made him uniquely positioned to recognize the problem and envision a solution. Before the war, Henderson had worked as a designer for a civilian shoe company in Massachusetts, specializing in work boots for industrial applications. He understood foot biomechanics, material properties, and manufacturing processes in ways that traditional military officers did not. Henderson had been observing the boot crisis with growing frustration since arriving in theater in early 1943. As a supply officer, he was responsible for requisitioning and distributing equipment, which meant he saw firsthand the constant flow of damaged boots being turned. The medical reports documenting foot injuries, the requisitions for replacements that could never be filled fast enough. He had examined captured Japanese jikatabi with professional interest, recognizing design elements that addressed problems the M1938 completely ignored. He had also studied the jump boots worn by American paratroopers during training, boots that featured higher ankle support and reinforced construction, but which were manufactured in such small quantities that they remained unavailable to most airborne units in the Pacific. In April 1943, Henderson submitted a detailed technical proposal through official channels, outlining a design for a new combat boot specifically engineered for airborne operations in tropical environments. His design incorporated several radical departures from traditional military footwear. The boot would extend to mid-calf, providing ankle support comparable to ski boots or mountaineering footwear. The upper would be constructed from canvas treated with water-resistant compounds, allowing the boot to dry quickly while maintaining durability. The sole would be made from vulcanized rubber with an aggressive tread pattern designed specifically for jungle terrain. The interior would feature cushioning to absorb landing shock and reduce stress injuries. Most controversially, Henderson proposed incorporating design elements from the Japanese jikatabi, including reinforced toe areas and a sole pattern that enhanced balance on uneven ground. The proposal was rejected within 2 weeks. The official response from the Quartermaster Corps cited multiple reasons for denial. Canvas was not an appropriate material for combat boots because it lacked the durability and protective qualities of leather. The proposed design was too expensive to manufacture in the quantities needed to equip airborne divisions. The incorporation of Japanese design elements was inappropriate and potentially damaging to morale if soldiers learned they were wearing boots inspired by enemy equipment. Most damningly, the Quartermaster Corps assessment concluded that the current M1938 boot was adequate for all combat applications when properly maintained, and that reports of widespread failures reflected poor soldier discipline rather than equipment defects. Henderson, frustrated but not defeated, took an approach that would have gotten him court-martialed if discovered. Using his position as supply officer, he diverted funds meant for routine equipment purchases and contracted with a small factory in Sydney that manufactured industrial safety boots for Australian mining companies. He provided them with his design specifications and requested 50 pairs of prototype boots for field testing. The factory, happy for the business and unconcerned with military procurement regulations, produced the boots in 6 weeks. In June 1943, Henderson quietly distributed the prototype boots to volunteers from a platoon of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, including Staff Sergeant Thomas Reeves. The soldiers were instructed to wear the boots during training exercises and combat operations, to document any problems or deficiencies, and to say nothing to anyone outside the platoon about where the boots came from. Henderson made clear that he was operating outside official channels and that if anyone asked questions, the boots had been personally purchased by the soldiers themselves from local vendors. Reeves received his pair of the experimental boots with deep skepticism. They looked strange compared to traditional military footwear, more like something a civilian would wear hiking than proper combat gear. The canvas upper seemed flimsy compared to leather. The high-top design extending halfway up his calf looked excessive. The rubber sole with its deep tread pattern reminded him of tire treads rather than boot soles. But after months of dealing with rotting M1938 boots that crippled his feet, Reeves was willing to try anything that might work better. The first field exercise using the new boots was a revelation. The platoon conducted a practice jump followed by a 15-mile forced march through heavy jungle conditions designed to replicate combat operations. Reeves landed hard as always, but his ankles held firm, the high-top boot providing support that prevented the rolling motion that had caused sprains in previous jumps. His feet hit the ground and stayed stable, the cushioned insole absorbing shock that would have transmitted straight through the thin leather soles of the M1938. He came up from his landing roll and moved out immediately, no hesitation, no shooting pain, just solid contact with the ground and confidence that his boots would hold up. During the march that followed, the advantages became even more obvious. The aggressive tread pattern gripped muddy trails and moss-covered logs that would have been treacherous in leather-soled boots. The canvas upper soaked through within the first hour, as always happened in jungle conditions, dried completely within 3 hours after the rain stopped, something leather never did. By the end of the 15-mile march, Reeves's feet were tired but not damaged, no blisters, no hot spots, no blood soaking through his socks. Around him, the other soldiers wearing the experimental boots reported similar experiences, a level of foot comfort that none of them had experienced since arriving in the Pacific. The contrast with soldiers still wearing M1938 boots was stark. The regular infantry company that had conducted the same march alongside the paratroopers limped back into camp with half their men suffering from foot injuries requiring medical attention. The company first sergeant, a career soldier with 20 years of service, examined Reeves's boots with professional interest and asked where he could get a pair for his own feet. Reeves, remembering Henderson's instructions about secrecy, claimed he had bought them from a shop in Sydney and didn't remember which one. Over the following weeks, as the platoon continued training and the boots held up to repeated jumps and extended operations, word began to spread through the regiment that some lucky soldiers had found footwear that actually worked. Requests for information about where to obtain similar boots flooded the supply office. Henderson, watching this grassroots enthusiasm with satisfaction, compiled detailed reports on the boots' performance, including testimonials from the soldiers who had worn them and comparative injury statistics showing dramatically reduced rates of foot casualties compared to units wearing standard-issue footwear. In August 1943, Henderson submitted a second proposal to the Quartermaster Corps, this time backed by field data from what Furjolers also Lunder Furwajas. Ritual lumber combat conditions rather than theoretical arguments. He included photographs of the boots after months of hard use showing minimal wear, medical reports documenting reduced injury rates, and enthusiastic endorsements from company commanders who had observed the difference in performance. He also included cost analysis demonstrating that while the new boots were more expensive to manufacture initially, their dramatically longer service life made them more economical over time than M1938 boots that had to be replaced every 6 weeks. The second proposal received a different reception than the first. By late 1943, the boot crisis had become impossible to ignore at higher levels of command. Casualty reports from airborne operations consistently showed landing injuries accounting for significant percentages of total casualties, sometimes exceeding combat losses. Medical officers throughout the Pacific Theater had been filing reports documenting epidemic levels of foot injuries, tropical ulcers, and fungal infections directly attributable to inadequate footwear. The logistical burden of constantly replacing failed boots was straining supply lines already struggling to deliver ammunition, food, and medical supplies to forward units. More significantly, American military leadership had begun to recognize a pattern that should have been obvious from the start. In case after case across multiple theaters and equipment categories, initial assumptions about American technological superiority and Asian backwardness were proving dangerously wrong. Japanese torpedoes were more advanced than American weapons. Japanese aircraft in some categories outperformed American. Japanese small unit tactics were more sophisticated than American doctrine had anticipated. The comfortable pre-war conviction that America's superiors abutchul in order formis virtual lebed with solis prachil was collapsing under the weight of combat experience. A team of Quartermaster Corps officers was dispatched to Australia in September 1943 to evaluate Henderson's proposal and examine the prototype boots under field conditions. The team included Major William Ashford, a career procurement officer who had spent 20 years managing military footwear contracts and who arrived in theater deeply skilled that a junior supply officer and a civilian shoe designer could have solved problems that had stumped the entire military procurement system. Ashford's skepticism began to erode within hours of arriving when he observed a company of paratroopers conducting jump training, half-wearing standard M1938 boots and half-wearing Henderson's prototypes. The difference was immediately visible. Soldiers in M1938 boots landed with visible hesitation, hitting the ground and pausing to assess whether their ankles had held up before moving. Soldiers in the prototype boots landed and moved out immediately with confidence that their footwear would provide the support needed. The landing injury rate for the M1938 equipped soldiers was 12%, consistent with reports from across the Pacific. The injury rate for soldiers wearing prototypes was less than 2%, and those injuries were from genuine mishaps unrelated to footwear rather than systemic equipment failures. Ashford spent 2 weeks in Australia observing airborne units, interviewing soldiers about their experiences, examining boots that had been in service for months, and reviewing Henderson's design specifications and manufacturing processes. By the end of his inspection, his initial skepticism had been replaced by enthusiasm for a design that clearly solved problems that traditional military thinking had been unable to address. His report back to the Quartermaster Corps was unequivocal in recommending immediate adoption of Henderson's design for all airborne units, with consideration of adapting the design for general infantry use throughout the Pacific Theater. The bureaucratic obstacles to actually implementing this recommendation were formidable. Military procurement in 1943 was a massive system involving contracts with hundreds of manufacturers, quality specifications refined over decades, testing protocols that required months or years to complete, and appropriations from Congress that were allocated years in advance. Introducing a radically new boot design meant canceling existing contracts, finding new manufacturers capable of producing the canvas and rubber boots at scale, revising quality standards, and convincing congressional committees that spending money on new footwear was justified when existing boots were already purchased and in the supply system. What broke through these obstacles was the personal intervention of General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area. MacArthur, whose command included all American airborne units in the Pacific Theater, had been receiving regular reports on landing injury rates and equipment failures. In November 1943, during a visit to Australia to inspect training of the 11th Airborne Division, MacArthur observed a demonstration of the prototype boots and spoke directly with paratroopers about their equipment challenges. MacArthur, whatever his other flaws, understood the importance of equipment that worked and the catastrophic cost of sending soldiers into combat with gear that failed them. MacArthur's message to the War Department was characteristically blunt. Either the Quartermaster Corps would immediately authorize production of the new jungle jump boots and deliver them to Pacific Airborne units within 3 months, or he would use his authority as theater commander to procure the boots independently using Australian contractors and theater command funds, bypassing the entire military procurement system. This was not an empty threat. MacArthur had both the authority and the willingness to ignore Washington when he believed his command's needs were not being met. Faced with the prospect of the theater commander publicly undermining the procurement system, the War Department authorized immediate production. The result was the boot that would become standard issue for American airborne forces for the remainder of World War II and beyond. Officially designated the M1943 parachutist boot, though soldiers simply called them jungle jump boots, they incorporated all of Henderson's design innovations. Canvas uppers extended to mid-calf and were treated with water-resistant compounds that allowed rapid drying while maintaining durability. Rubber soles featured aggressive tread patterns specifically designed for tropical terrain. Interior cushioning absorbed landing shock and reduced stress injuries. Reinforced toe and heel areas provided protection comparable to leather while maintaining the weight savings of canvas construction. The first production boots reached combat units in February 1944, distributed initially to airborne regiments conducting operations in New Guinea and preparing for larger operations in the Philippines. The transformation in operational capability was immediate and dramatic. Landing injury rates dropped from 15 to 20% down to less than 5%. Foot injuries from tropical ulcers and fungal infections declined by more than half. The frequency of boot replacements decreased from every 6 weeks to every 6 months. Medical officers reported significant improvements in overall unit health and combat readiness directly attributable to better footwear. Staff Sergeant Thomas Reeves received his official issue M1943 jungle jump boots in March 1944, replacing the prototype pairing that had served him well for 9 months but were finally wearing out. The new boots felt familiar because they were essentially identical to what he had been wearing, but the psychological impact of having official equipment that actually worked was profound. For the first time since arriving in the Pacific, Reeves and his fellow felt that their own military was providing them with gear designed for the missions they were being asked to perform rather than generic equipment that happened to be available. The Japanese prisoners who had mocked American boots back in March 1943 had a very different reaction when they observed American paratroopers wearing the new footwear during operations in the Philippines in late 1944. The captured Japanese soldiers, many of whom had been in the field for months or years, were now wearing footwear that was falling apart as their own supply lines collapsed under American air attacks. The Jacatabi, once superior to American boots, were unavailable as replacements because Japanese logistics could no longer deliver even basic supplies to isolated garrisons. Japanese soldiers were wrapping their feet in cloth, fashioning makeshift sandals from whatever materials they could scavenge, or going barefoot because they had no alternative. Meanwhile, American paratroopers jumped into combat wearing boots specifically designed for Pacific operations, boots that provided support, protection, and durability that Japanese equipment could no longer match. The technological balance had shifted completely, not because American equipment had always been superior, but because American industrial capacity, once properly directed, could identify problems, engineer solutions, and manufacture equipment at scales that Japan could never hope to match. One particular incident crystallized this reversal in circumstances. In December 1944, during operations to clear Japanese forces from the mountains of Leyte, Reeves's platoon captured a group of Japanese soldiers who had been surviving in the jungle for weeks with virtually no supplies. The prisoners were in desperate condition, malnourished, suffering from tropical diseases, and most notably, nearly barefoot because their footwear had completely disintegrated. One prisoner, an older sergeant who spoke some English, examined Reeves's M1943 boots with professional interest, and made a comment that the interpreter translated as recognition that American equipment had surpassed Japanese gear. The sergeant, through the interpreter, explained that he had been an infantryman since the invasion of China in 1937 and had worn Jacatabi throughout campaigns in China, Malaya, and the Philippines. He acknowledged that Japanese footwear had been superior to American boots early in the Pacific War, but noted that everything had changed. American boots were now better designed, better manufactured, and most importantly, actually available to American soldiers in the field. Japanese equipment, even when well designed, was increasingly unavailable as the logistics system collapsed. A superior boot in a warehouse in Japan was worthless to a soldier in the Philippines who needed footwear immediately. This conversation conducted through an interpreter in a muddy clearing while Japanese prisoners ate their first substantial meal in weeks encapsulated the broader trajectory of the Pacific War. Japan had entered the conflict with significant technological advantages in certain areas and with military equipment that was in many cases superior to what Allied forces initially possessed. But Japan lacked the industrial capacity, the resource base, and the logistics system to maintain those advantages against an enemy that could learn from defeats, engineer solutions to problems, and manufacture equipment at scales that overwhelmed any qualitative advantages Japan might possess. The boot crisis and its resolution demonstrated several principles that extended far beyond footwear. First, initial technological superiority is meaningless if it cannot be sustained over time. Japanese Jakatabi were better than American 1938 boots, but when supply lines collapsed and replacements became unavailable, that superiority became irrelevant. Second, the ability to recognize failures, accept criticism, and implement changes is more valuable than starting with perfect equipment. American boots were terrible in early Pacific operations, but the system eventually acknowledged this and produced something better. Third, industrial capacity and logistics matter more than individual equipment quality when scaled across years of sustained operations. The broader pattern visible in the boot story repeated itself across virtually every category of military equipment during the Pacific War. American weapons that were initially inferior to Japanese counterparts improved through iterative design and massive production. American tactics that failed against Japanese veterans evolved through painful experience. American logistics that struggled initially to support forces across vast Pacific distances eventually created supply lines that Japanese forces could never interdict effectively. The war became a contest not of initial advantages but of sustained capability, of learning and adaptation, of industrial production that simply overwhelmed enemy capacity to respond. By early 1945, American airborne forces conducting operations in the Philippines and preparing for the planned invasion of Japan were equipped with boots that were arguably the best military with luxury footwear in the world for jungle and tropical operations. Japanese forces defending these same territories wore whatever they could scavenge or went barefoot. This was not because American boots had always been superior but because the American system, for all its flaws and initial failures, had eventually produced equipment that worked and delivered it to soldiers who needed it. The Japanese system, strangled by submarine warfare and strategic bombing, could not. The ultimate irony of the boot story was that Japanese military observers, filing reports on captured American equipment throughout 1944 and 1945, noted with alarm that American boots had improved dramatically and now surpassed Japanese footwear in every meaningful category. These reports, like so many intelligence assessments during the war, arrived too late to influence strategy or resource allocation. By the time Japanese military leadership understood that American equipment was improving while Japanese equipment was becoming unavailable, the war was already lost. The logistics system that could have delivered better equipment to Japanese forces had been destroyed. The industrial capacity that could have manufactured improved designs had been bombed into rubble or starved of raw materials. The moment for Japanese technological advantages to matter had passed. Staff Sergeant Thomas Reeves survived the war, participating in airborne operations in the Philippines and preparing for operations against Japan that were rendered unnecessary by Japanese surrender in August 1945. He returned to Pennsylvania in October 1945, carrying with him a pair of worn but still functional M1943 jungle jump boots that had served him through nearly 2 years of combat operations. He kept those boots for the rest of his life, not as a souvenir of combat or a memorial to fallen comrades, but as a reminder that wars are won not by the equipment you start with, but by the ability to recognize failures, engineer solutions, and deliver what works to the people who need it. The boots represented everything about American victory in the Pacific: initial failure followed by systematic improvement, industrial capacity overwhelming enemy advantages, and the unglamorous reality that wars are won by logistics and equipment as much as by tactics and courage. The transformation in American airborne capability after widespread distribution of the M1943 jungle jump boots represented more than just improved footwear. It signaled a fundamental shift in how American military forces approached equipment design and procurement for specialized warfare. The success of Henderson's unauthorized innovation had demonstrated that solutions to combat problems often came from officers and soldiers with direct field experience rather than from distant procurement bureaucracies operating according to peacetime regulations. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, this pattern repeated itself across multiple equipment categories as American forces learned to privilege field experience over theoretical expertise. Parachutes were redesigned based on feedback from paratroopers who had used them in combat. Weapons were modified based on reports from soldiers who had fired them in jungle conditions. Uniforms evolved to address the specific challenges of tropical warfare rather than conforming to traditions established for temperate climates. The Japanese military, observing this evolution through intelligence reports and examination of captured American equipment, recognized too late that they were facing an enemy whose greatest advantage was not initial technological superiority but systematic capacity for improvement. Japanese equipment design had stagnated after early war successes, partially because military culture discouraged criticism of existing systems and partially because resource shortages made development of new equipment increasingly difficult. By 1944, Japanese soldiers were fighting with essentially the same equipment they had carried in 1941. The contrast was visible in every category of personal equipment. American paratroopers in 1944 wore uniforms specifically designed for tropical airborne operations, featuring reinforced stress points, quick-drying fabrics, and pocket configurations optimized for jumping with heavy loads. Japanese paratroopers wore uniforms that differed little from those worn by conventional infantry. Most critically, American forces had equipment that actually reached them in the field while Japanese equipment sat in warehouses unreachable due to submarine devastation of their merchant fleet. The psychological impact of this equipment disparity extended beyond mere tactical advantages. Japanese soldiers defending positions in the Philippines in late 1944 could observe their American opponents and recognize that they faced enemies who were not only more numerous but better equipped in every meaningful category. American paratroopers jumping into combat wore boots that worked, uniforms that lasted, and carried weapons that fired reliably. Japanese defenders wore clothing rotting off their bodies, boots that had disintegrated, and fired weapons increasingly unreliable due to lack of proper maintenance supplies. The Japanese prisoners who had mocked American boots in March 1943 experienced a very different arc of recognition. Those who survived to be recaptured in 1944 and 1945 found themselves wearing footwear that had completely disintegrated while their American captors wore boots specifically engineered for tropical conditions. Initial amusement at American equipment failures had been replaced by grim acknowledgement that American forces had solved their problems while Japanese forces could not even obtain replacements. One conversation recorded by an American intelligence officer interviewing Japanese prisoners in early 1945 captured this recognition. A Japanese sergeant noted that early in the war, Japanese soldiers had viewed American forces as poorly equipped and unprepared for jungle warfare. American boots had been particularly inadequate, a source of amusement among Japanese troops. By 1944, the situation had completely reversed. American soldiers wore specialized boots designed for tropical conditions while Japanese forces wore whatever they could scavenge or went barefoot because replacement footwear never arrived. This assessment aligned with what American military leadership had concluded about the Pacific War's trajectory. By early 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japanese forces fought with determination, but they were fighting without adequate supplies, without equipment replacements, without the logistical support that modern military operations required. American forces advanced with confidence born of material superiority so overwhelming that tactical setbacks were temporary and strategic success was inevitable. The boot story exemplified the fundamental dynamic that determined the war's outcome. Wars between industrial powers are won by the side that can sustain combat operations over years of sustained conflict, that can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them, that can learn from failures and implement improvements while continuing to fight. The Japanese military had demonstrated tactical excellence and possessed equipment that was in many categories equal or superior to what Allied forces initially possessed. But Japan lacked the industrial base to sustain production at scales needed for prolonged conflict and lacked the institutional culture that encouraged criticism and rapid implementation of improvements. Staff Sergeant Thomas Reeves, returning to civilian life in Pennsylvania in late 1945, brought with him understanding that success in any complex endeavor requires not just good initial planning but capacity to recognize failures, implement improvements, and sustain effort over time despite setbacks. The boot crisis had taught him that initial advantage matters less than systematic improvement, that willingness to acknowledge problems is more valuable than defending inadequate systems, that practical solutions from field experience trump theoretical expertise from distant bureaucracies. The M1943 jungle jump boots served American airborne forces not just through the end of World War II but through subsequent conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The basic design proved sound enough that modifications built on the original concept rather than requiring complete redesign. This design philosophy, learned through painful experience, influenced American military equipment development across all categories. The tendency toward generic equipment gave way to more specialized equipment optimized for specific missions. The assumption that laboratory testing was sufficient gave way to extensive field testing under realistic conditions. By war's end, the contrast was visible in every detail of how soldiers on opposing sides were equipped. American paratroopers wore boots designed specifically for their mission and manufactured to precise specifications. Japanese soldiers wore whatever they could scavenge or went barefoot. American logistics delivered supplies forward faster than units could consume them. Japanese logistics had collapsed so completely that isolated garrisons starved while supplies sat unused in warehouses in Japan. The story that began with Japanese prisoners mocking American boots ended with Japanese prisoners studying American boots and trying to understand how such complete reversal had occurred in so short a time. The answer was visible in the boots themselves, in their specialized design, in their robust construction, in the fact that they existed and were being worn by soldiers in combat zones. The boots represented everything about American victory: capacity to learn from failures, industrial strength to produce solutions at scale, and logistics capability to deliver equipment where it was needed. Staff Sergeant Thomas Reeves kept his worn M1943 jungle jump boots for the rest of his life as a reminder of lessons learned through hard experience. Success required acknowledging failures rather than defending them. Improvement required listening to people with direct experience rather than distant experts. Victory required sustained effort and systematic advantage rather than initial superiority. The boots that had been mocked became boots that were studied. The equipment that had failed became equipment that worked. The forces that had been unprepared became forces that were overwhelming, proving that wars are won by the side that learns fastest and implements improvements most effectively. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.